Hello, and welcome to the final podcast for World War II Resistance Narratives with Professor Barnard. My name is Matt Beaudry, and I'm here with...
I'm Kevin LaSalle.
And Alex Jacques.
And I'm really glad we were able to get three people together for this, because now the podcast can have more of the discussion element to it, too. And I thought it was just going to be a lot more of me saying things about these films, which nobody wants to watch or nobody wants to listen to, and especially not anyone from class, because I've said enough of my thoughts there.
Yeah, and that's like, at that point, it could just be a paper if we're just like each of us had our own individual thoughts. This allows us kind of to have different angles to approach it and kind of approach concepts in a more communal way.
Yeah, it's also related to the nature of the Call 400 final project, in which you're taught to address audiences you don't usually do. And so, for me, I'd never done a podcast before, and so I went to Professor Barnard with this idea, and, I think we're discussing and analyzing these films with the knowledge of watching them, because ultimately we are, kind of demonstrating our knowledge for these films for a final grade in the course. And, I'm excited for this, and the topic we've chosen to discuss is examining the varying depictions of Nazis in these films and looking at how that varies with the country of origin and diving into a little bit of the contemporary social and historical forces that may be influencing those changes. And then we'll toss around ideas about connections between them.
Yeah, like as a genre, resistance films can be kind of a broad thing, but so while they can be stories of resistance and Nazis, where they were made, when they were made, the social context has a lot to do with the depictions of the characters on screen, and it'll be interesting to see what factors went into how those were interpreted.
Yeah.
So the first film we're going to discuss is Casablanca, a 1942 classic starring Humphrey Bogart. A little rundown of the film. It's about a guy kind of running from his past, and he's meets an old flame and is kind of forced to make a decision whether he wants to take an action in the greater global conflict kind of thing. And the depiction of Nazis, I don't know. What do we think they were in the film?
So my perception of the Nazis in the film was that they're there and they're bad, that they have an effect on the plot, but we see the Nazis there, but not so much as a Nazi character that's really fleshed out.
For sure. I felt like more than other films, they were almost an afterthought to the romance of the film.
Yeah, they're definitely not the central focus of the film. They're more of an antagonizing presence. And when we think about when the film was made and the reasons why it's made, this depiction becomes a little bit more clear in my eyes.
The fact that it was made during the war?
Yeah, it was made during the war, and it was produced by the War Council, too. And so, at this time, the Americans were still figuring out whether or not they were going to fully enter World War II. And so...
Yeah, keep going.
And this film was meant to draw support for that.
Yeah, I also think with the Nazis in the film, watching this early in class, earlier in the semester, we hadn't really gotten to a depiction of a Nazi as being just the bad guy. And I think here, having the Nazi not completely fleshed out in the film, that just makes us look at this simple bad guy look.
Yeah, and that's the simple bad guy look in Casablanca for a reason. We think that, or at least I personally believe that it's very deliberate on the part of the War Council in terms of mapping on the themes of the time to the characters. Like, even though America might not necessarily want to stick its neck out for everyone else, just like Rick, it has to get into the war.
Like you definitely see Laszlo in, or France in the character Laszlo and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But, what was I going to say? So, are there any moments that actually stick out with Nazis in the film to y'all? I just kind of feel like they're foot soldiers more than anything else, just like the approaching almost police force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that. So when I thought about the movie and I thought about the Nazis and Rick, one scene specifically stuck out to me. It's when he shoots the Nazi at the end of the film. Mm-hmm. And he says, "Put down the phone, put down the phone."
Yeah.
And he finally fires this gun. and kills him. And that's some of the only action we see in the film. Like, someone is shot in the very opening sequence, and Rick shoots a Nazi in the end. And I think it's interesting that that's a very singular moment in the film. It's a very definitive point when Rick is choosing to shoot that Nazi, and it's depicted as such.
And I think it's also interesting in this film that the Nazis aren't necessarily the antagonist to Rick. They're the antagonist to the resistance. And it's kind of like this in the next film we'll discuss. He has to be motivated to stand up and actually go into conflict with them, because otherwise he wouldn't be forced to be that way. But it's just the ideologically, I guess, right thing to do for him to stand up to them there.
Yeah, and I think that's why Casablanca just contrasts so well with The Train, which is another American film about the war and the Nazis, but it's made 20 years later, and the depictions of the Nazis are very different because of that. So The Train focuses on the real-life story of a art train heist leaving France to Berlin. It's based on a true story, but the actual true story has a lot less action in it than the film itself. And the film itself is an action movie that's made in the 60s to earn money. So that's going to have a different purpose and different depiction of the Nazis than a 1942 movie.
Yeah, I feel like it wasn't interested in why the Nazis were bad. Felt like it was just like, we had 20 years hindsight. We knew we were the good guys. We knew they were the bad guys. Let's see. It was von Waldheim. I felt like he was just kind of like a mustache twirling, just in that final scene with the train crashed. Yeah. He was like, "Oh, what was this all for? You don't even know. It was just monologuing almost. Just it was, while Casablanca was kind of showing like maybe like different groups that were being oppressed, or and definitely later films showed specific things, obviously, that the Nazis stood for that were wrong, and how they suppressed cultures, and how they genocide on top of a horrible thing. But this film was just like, we know where they're the bad guys. Let's turn them into the evil force for these action set pieces to be set around.
Yeah, and I think similarly though, between Casablanca and The Train, these Nazis aren't fleshed out as much as later films that we'll see. We don't see kind of a spectrum between, who's good in the war and who's bad in the war. It just seems like they're standing there as, just a threat that doesn't really have a dynamic role.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think the time and why the two movies were made kind of influences that too. Because in 1942, the Nazis represented this threat that needed to be taken action against. And Rick was supposed to show that threat needed to be taken action against. In The Train, Labiche needs someone to fight. And the Nazis are there.
Yeah, so I feel like with those first two films, they were using the Nazis in comparison to the American identity and what role Americans were serving, kind of thing, in the global conflict. So I think this is a good transition point to kind of look at European films and how they might have a little bit of a different take on Nazis, perhaps more nuanced. Alex, you definitely wanted to talk about Flame and Citron, right?
Yeah, I did. Just a little summary of the film, just to set up, what the Nazis' role in this film was. Basically, the main discussion of the film revolved around the greatness of war. This mostly alludes to the struggles and experiences that Flame and Citron undergo as they fight the Nazis. However, I think the conversation extends to how the Nazis in the movie, specifically Hoffman, the head SS leader, plays a role regarding Nazi perception. So, Hoffman, the head of the Nazi forces in Denmark at the time, was known to be a sinister, evil officer that may have disrupted the gray narrative of war due to his obvious, uncontroversial dislike by all resistors.
So this Hoffman guy, would you say he's more fleshed out than in the American films?
Yeah, definitely. In the final scene of the film, Hoffman is portrayed as actually not sinister in comparison to his other officers, because they were, as after Flame and Citron's death, his other officers were mocking, the dead bodies of the two resistors, and Hoffman comes out and tells them to cut it out. And that scene just kind of questions, the narrative of, why was this scene even included in the film? Showing that Hoffman did some humane act right at the end. It just brings up question about the Nazi perception.
Yeah, maybe that was just a little bit of a different take by the Danish filmmakers. Not necessarily sympathy for the Nazis, but understanding something along the lines of in war, like the humanity's removed from everyone a little bit, where even the Nazi who was the ultimate evil understood that, like, these are my enemies, but they're a product of where we are and this horror that we're living among. And I don't know, maybe there's something the Danish are saying back there.
Yeah, definitely. I think European films might have a different perception of it. Also because although the U.S. was doing a lot of things in the war effort, there wasn't like mainland fighting on the U.S. and there was an occupation of the U.S. territory. And I think that's just a whole different nature of a task or a challenge to weather and fight the Nazis through.
I also think, looking at when the film was made in 2008, which is obviously a far time after the war, might reflect, the emotions that were going on. And this time could have allowed for emotions to settle and maybe reflect on just humanity as a whole. And I just think that, Madsen, the director, after reflecting on the affair, believed that the Nazis did have a heart, and maybe was trying to prove that everyone had a heart.
Yeah, and I think the time's key there, where he's not endorsing anything they stood for, but more saying that you have to understand that no matter how evil something is historically, or a group may be, groups are made up of individuals, and there's degrees to it, kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. So, Alex, in this last scene where Hoffman shows his humanity, it's mainly he seems better than the other Nazis. Is that what you're saying? So he's good, but good by comparison to the other Nazis. Like, do you think that kind of affects the morality of it at all?
I just think that it was included just to show maybe the general perception of Nazis, not specifically to Hoffman, but maybe to everyone, that regardless where you are in terms of working, being a part of the SS or being a low officer, just if they're humane at all. And I think it was just demonstrating that there is a humane, portion to who they are.
Yeah. So the two main protagonists, Flame and Citron, they're the badass resistance fighters. One's very cool and one goes down in a blaze of glory. And so how does that role contrast with the Nazis in the film? Does that change the nature of the relationship between the two?
I think that that could just speak to, again, like the human race and who they are. I think that, both sides encountered, cruel moments, when Flame and Citron accidentally, hurt a child, shot a child, and the child had to go to the hospital. And obviously, the SS and all the Nazis at the end were gunning down Citron in that final scene. So I think there's something to be said on both sides.
Yeah.
And then I think just on top of it showing, obviously, the resistors are fighting for, a just cause. And then the SS officer being portrayed as kind of humane. It just shows there's ambiguity between, who, is there really someone who's good, like completely good and completely bad? How are they similar?
Yeah, I definitely got that idea, or I got that feeling with the film, where it was like the Nazis were not good guys. I don't want to get that like mixed up in any way just by
definitely.
this last sentiment. But the fact that even the heroes or the people who were on the Allied forces, war turned them into darker versions of themselves, or if nothing else, transformed them. Like both Flame and Citron went through major transformations in the film, and that might be saying more than anything the way that trauma can affect our character, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And this film reminds me of another film that's also European. It's Norway, and it's Norwegian, and it's about a Norwegian resistance hero named Max Manus. And that name is just got the great alliteration, and it was very popular, and he's a well-known figure. But there was a criticism of it that it turns into more of a hero worship, and it reduces things to black and white and props up these resistance fighters that might have been doing some ethically questionable things.
Yeah, I felt like there was really nothing setting the Nazis apart or what they believed in or even what Max Manus stood for as much in that movie. I really get what you mean about it being a hero movie because, like, between his PTSD of former conflicts and just, like, the blaze of action, it definitely is more about him than it is the Nazis or what they stand for kind of thing is how I read it.
And finishing up that thought on Max Manus, the depictions of the Nazis are once again mainly an antagonist, but there's one scene that sticks out, and it's when Max is on his way to his final mission. Like, he's nearly suicidal, he's lost everything at this point, and he feels like he has to go out in a blaze of glory. And he tells that to a Nazi he sees on the train going there. He says, "I hope I see your body in that icy water when I blow up the boat." And then he does. He sees that body, and the audience sees that body too. And so the Nazis are there, and what they are to Max Manus is something that's got to be dealt with, even though it's hard for them.
Transitioning to another European resistance narrative, I feel like I Am a Teacher actually had something really interesting to say with how they were using the Nazis in the film. Quick reminder, Pavel's a teacher in a Russian town that's occupied. He doesn't really he doesn't love the occupying Nazi force, but he lives with it, with his wife and his family until they just keep taking and taking and taking until he's forced to take action at some point. And what I really feel in this film is, more than anything else, the Nazis represent losing a national identity, in this case Russianness. He's a teacher and he has to pretty much disclaim or disown communism, and Pushkin at one point in the film, who's a Russian poet, and he has to heroize or lionize Hitler in his lesson plan. And it's just kind of slowly losing pride until you wonder what's left, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that through the film, just looking at how the Nazis are portrayed, kind of the actions that they took throughout the film forces Pavel to realize, the oppressive forces treat nothing personal as sacred, and that the Nazis really were not humane at all throughout the film. And I'm just trying to figure out, how the times and the year kind of reflect this.
Yeah, the mate for sure. There's one main Nazi in the film, and then there's a Russian traitor who I guess he's a Nazi too. He's a former Russian, but and they represent.
He's a Nazi. Why not?
Yeah,
Nazi.
I don't mess with them. They represent totally different things. And the one who's a German, he's the occupying force. He wants to take away Russianness. He has that scene where he makes Pavel. He beats him up in front of his class, totally embarrasses him, and makes him shoot the picture of Pushkin. And that's the same guy, like Alex was talking about, like, no respect for what's personal. He's the same guy who knows who Pavel's fiance is and still makes sexual advances on her and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think contrasting that first Nazi with the Russian traitor, I think it's very interesting how the Russian traitor showed up second in the film. Like, you have this one Nazi antagonist, and he's set up as being there and being present. He's really wrecking Pavel's life. And he's very German, and he kind of represents that German force. But then there's the Russian traitor.
And he almost represents, like, what the Nazis can make them become. Because the German is the evil of Nazis, but the Russian to Pavel is like his shadow almost. Pavel's struggling with losing a sense of what he stands for. And this character totally stands for nothing. He's all about survival, which is a big theme throughout the movie. At one point, the two Nazis are having a conversation, and the German asks him or something, and the traitor pretty much says something along the lines of, "I'm doing what any sane person would do, and I'm surviving." And I think that represents losing a sense of who you are, kind of thing for Pavel.
Yeah, and I definitely think both of those Nazis represent different threats. And with the German, like, what the bad thing is the Nazis are doing, you're resisting. But it's more insidious with the Russian traitor, because he's not explicitly with the Nazis, but there's the fear of him turning the countrymen of Russia into Nazis and into fascists. And that's where Pavel comes in with his identity too, because the film is titled I Am a Teacher, and that's really central to Pavel's identity. I think a big turning point in the film was when that Russian traitor, the Nazi, said, I am his teacher now.
And I think that's something we miss in resistance narratives a lot. People wonder, why did these totally outmatched forces fight some of the time and stuff like that? And it's you're resisting to keep who you are. It's not just your land and your life. It's even if you're already defeated in some senses and occupied, you're fighting to hold on to any semblance of what was in your past, kind of thing, because in a generation or two, if you don't hold on to it, it's gone forever.
Yeah, and it takes Pavel a while to realize this in the film. There are 3 separate assassination attempts, and Pavel fails at the first 2. And the soldier who was supposed to be making that shot has a conversation with Pavel about the nature of resistance, and Pavel asks him just, why are you fighting? And the soldier says, Pavel, you're a teacher, you should know. And that's, even though Pavel is a teacher, he doesn't know, but he has to learn.
And you would think he would get it, because teachers should be about holding the torch, or handing off the torch and continuing knowledge to the next generation. It's a selfless thing. But the first 2 assassination attempts represent how he's totally motivated by selfishness throughout the early acts of the film, and that's why he's unable to really break free and become a resistance figure till the end. But when he does, he is able to be an icon for the kids.
Yeah, and that's the ultimate message of the movie, too. He makes a sacrifice, and his adopted son lives on and carries the Russian spirit.
So, going off I Am a Teacher, another film that comes to mind when kind of complicating the good and bad narrative of the Nazi and just kind of complicating their image is Black Book. And I know, Matt, you had some things you wanted to tie in there in terms of moral relativism and the Nazis.
Yeah, so this was one of my favorite films we'd viewed for the class. It's directed by Paul Verhoeven, which I don't know if anyone has really seen a lot of his movies, but he does RoboCop, he does Showgirls. He's known for very visually appealing and sometimes iconoclastic movies. And I think Black Book really fits in with this because it's a traditional World War II resistance narrative. It follows Rachel, who is a Jewish woman that's under persecution but ultimately escapes the Nazis, and then she becomes a spy for the resistance. But what is so interesting about Black Book and how it kind of flips the tail on its head is it's got evil resistance heroes and sympathetic Nazis.
So what do you think Verhoeven's motivation would be then to kind of give sympathetic Nazis and people who are maybe on the side of like what's ideologically right, why give them that kind of grayness? Why put the effort in there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and there's different reasons behind Verhoeven's choices here, but I think a primary one is trying to complicate the traditional narrative. That there's these resistance heroes who fought and were all good, and there's these Nazis who fought against that and were all bad, because Hans, the resistance leader, towards the end of the film, it's a pretty shocking twist, because he was someone who was very virtuous throughout the film, very heroic, tried to help Rachel, but then he tries to kill her, and it's found out that he's been collaborating with the Germans for money. And this stands in contrast to Muntz, who is also a love interest of Rachel, but she has to seduce him for the resistance. He's a Gestapo officer, but they end up actually falling in love, and she tries to save his life in the end.
So I guess the point at what I'm getting at here is why complicate the Nazis at all? Is it trying to... I get that we're adding layers to them, but what's Verhoeven's motivations there? Is it one of like trying to put aside differences thing? Is it maybe adding perspective? I'm confused on that point specifically.
I don't think it's necessarily putting aside differences or ignoring a problem. I would say it plays into awareness, and specifically in this movie.
Not differences necessarily, but our history.
Yeah, history. I think it plays into what Verhoeven is trying to construct with the themes of anti-Semitism seen in the movie. So Rachel is under constant threat, and so is her family and the other Jewish characters in the narrative. And she can never know who to trust because it's the collaborators that are so dangerous. And those are the people that might say they're good to your face, but then, like Hans has been doing, sell them out behind the back. And I think this is also shown in how the resistance group treats Rachel and her Jewishness when she is tricked and set up as a double agent, they believe that she turned like that and immediately start using Jewish slurs, saying hurtful and like just wrong things, insulting. And just because they were so quick to revert to that type of anti-Semitism, even though she didn't actually betray them, shows that the like resistance group had its own biases too.
Yeah, and how maybe something along the lines of how group mob mentalities can quickly turn people, kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Verhoeven also includes Muntz in that to give a skepticism about traditional narratives too. Like, the Nazis weren't the only threat to Jewish identity, and they don't remain the threat. There is a more existential threat of anti-Semitism.
So, continuing just with the Nazi narrative here, I noticed that Black Book is a 2006 film, so another recently made film. And I've just noticed, in comparison to other older films that we were analyzing at the beginning of this podcast, it seems that these new films are taking on a little more of a effort to flesh out and depict the Nazis. So it's just seemed like these earlier films created during and around the war were kind of using propaganda here and not really fleshing out Nazis, just looking at them as just like the bad guy. So what do you think, like, the times, like making a film around the time of the war and way after the film, like how does that affect how the Nazis are perceived?
I think the propaganda point definitely is big, because when we're especially right in the thick of war, you have to rally people. But when it's 60 years removed after the fact and quote unquote like we, as in the Allied powers, won, it's like you're just rubbing it in at that point.
Gets more
if you're gonna make a war story, you should have something to say at that point. If you're going that far back, and it should have something to say about stuff like we've mentioned, like national identity, and deeper themes overall.
Yeah, and national identity, I think, has played a key role, especially in just the depictions of Nazis. And these films serve a definitive purpose for the country of origin. These hero stories have shown to be powerful and even like very profitable in their original countries. And these films represent the social and political forces at play of the time of making it and what they thought about the Nazis too. So these Nazis can end up representing national conflicts, and they're very powerful symbols.
And yeah, it's more about what the Nazis meant to each group of people or the filmmakers than necessarily what, in each case, each tenet of the Nazi ideology, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I guess we can kind of think about it by looking at two extremes, like in the U.S., where the Nazis were this international threat and an ideology that had to be dealt with. While in France, for example, France collaborated with the Germans, and people lived with Germans for a number of years. And
they were more present. I feel for Americans, it's like you had to spur on the the sentiments of democracy and like the ties to Americanism almost in that way. In Europe, it wasn't a choice. It was just Nazis are there. You resist or you lose. What is yours?
Yeah, and so one of the most sympathetic images of a Nazi I think we've seen in the chorus was Ebernac in Silence of the Sea. And he was living with this French family who would never talk to him. And he was trying to be a pleasant guy in his eyes and try to form a relationship with these people, but they were just not having it. And that's the whole movie. I just don't think that's something that would come out of an American studio or be like about an American depiction of Nazis.
Definitely. You have to, villains in America, we have to have the scene where they push an old lady or something so we know it's the villain.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Rick's got to shoot the Nazi and then say he's got the hope to do it. But he's got to shoot the Nazi first.
Yeah, that seems as good of a point as any to wrap, just kind of capturing the broad idea that across the course of the class and different films of different origins, Nazis are depicted in a number of different ways because they serve a different cultural purpose in the context that film was made. So yeah, I feel like this was a really useful discussion.
Yeah, and it's really hard to determine exactly, what historical forces are determining this depiction of Nazis now. But I think it's important to toss around ideas on how
Definitely.
they play off.
These aren't
Yeah.
the facts of what the filmmakers necessarily wrote down in their journals, but it's how we read them, and that's a huge part of what film is. So, yeah, feels like as good of a time as any to wrap. Thanks for listening. This has been Kevin LaSalle.
This has been Matt Beaudry.
And Alex.
All right, thank you. Goodbye.